going to be showing you how to make a baby or lamb blanket. All you need is 2 meters of fabric. We really like to use Minky because it's soft, but we also use quilting cotton for the other side of the pattern. You should have 1 meter of each fabric that you're using, or 2 meters of one fabric. You'll also need corresponding thread, scissors, pins, and a sewing needle, as well as an iron to make sure everything is nice and crisp. Start by ironing your fabric. I didn't iron my Minky because I didn't want to crush the dimples, but it's up to you if it's a little wrinkly. If you're using 2 meters of the same fabric, you can cut it in half so each side is the same, or you can just fold it in half because it doesn't really make a difference. Lay out your fabric so they're aligned as best as possible, with the right sides together and the wrong sides out and visible. Using safety pins, pin together your layers along the outside of the edge of your fabric, leaving about half an inch to an inch of seam allowance between your pin and the edge of the fabric, as I've shown you. It doesn't have to be this far away, but it may make it easier when you're sewing to leave a little distance between your pins and the edge so you don't have to keep pulling them out if they're in the way. You can also use regular straight pins, but they may fall out as you're sewing and moving around, and you may get pricked. You can also baste your fabric together instead of pinning the edge, which I'll show you how to do in a second when we start sewing. Basting will save you some time, and it works a little better for hand sewing, but it's really up to what you prefer. If one side is larger, pin along the edges of the smaller fabric. Pin through the middle in a few parts to make sure it's really secure and doesn't shift as you're sewing. It took me about 10 minutes to pin mine. Then, cut off any excess if you have a larger side. I left the 2 smaller ends because they were only larger by about an inch, but I cut off the thicker sides because they would get in the way when I was sewing. I cut it about the same width all the way around so that if my smaller fabric shifted while I was sewing, it wouldn't be a big deal. I didn't mention this before, but it's really important for you to use a thimble. It makes it easier for you to sew, and you'll be faster, and it's a little bit safer for you to do so. But I couldn't find mine, so I wasn't using one. Thread your needle with about an arm's length of thread, then knot off the end of your thread. You can either knot off just one end and sew with a single thread, or knot the 2 ends together and sew with double thickness for extra strength, but it's up to you. I knotted a single end, so I could go for longer before I changed my thread out, but it doesn't really make a difference because the back stitch is pretty strong. To knot it, I like to wrap the end around my finger in an X, then rub it together with my pointer finger and my thumb until they're tangled. Then you can pull on the end and it should make a knot. This first stitch I'll show you is a back stitch. This is a stitch you'll use after you've pinned and basted, and it'll sew most of the blanket together. This is the hardest stitch to explain, so bear with me. You'll want to start by inserting your needle all the way through both layers, from the front to the back. Then, inserting your needle back into the back through the front so it's visible in 2 places on the front and 1 place on the back. It should be relatively flat on your blanket. Pull it through so you've pushed it through the back and into the front again in 1 step. It should look like you have 1 stitch on the back and none on the front. Now insert your needle through the back at the end of your first stitch, or in this case where your knot is, and into the front again, like you did the first time, but this time your stitch should be twice as long. So it's poking through the front around 1 stitch ahead and pull it through. That might sound a little confusing, but watch me if you're having difficulties, and I'll go through the steps again. Insert your needle through the front at the end of your last stitch so that it's poking through the back. Then, without pulling it through yet, push your needle through to the front just ahead of where your needle is coming through. It should look like your needle is blocking off a space 2 stitches wide, with your thread sticking through the middle. The front will look like neat stitches, and the back will look like overlapping stitches. After each stitch, pull your thread tight, but not so tight that the fabric puckers. You just don't want your stitches too loose. The next stitch is a running stitch. You're just going to teeter-totter in and out, always going through both sides so that your needle creates every other stitch on the top and every other stitch on the bottom as well. If you want to, you can manually push it through the front, turn over your project, then push it through the back, creating each stitch one at a time. But it's generally faster and more consistent to create multiple stitches at once by pushing it through the back, then pushing it through the front again without pulling it through. Then, once you have a couple stitches on your needle, you can pull it through again, always starting and ending on the same side so that you're not having to turn your project over and over each stitch. This will be your basting stitch, if you choose to baste instead of pin, and it will be your top stitch in the final step. To baste, you'll want to make your stitches really wide and don't tie off your ends, because you'll take out your basting stitches after you've properly sewn the section. For the top stitching, you'll make your stitches relatively small and want them to be tied off because they're not temporary. In the video, I've done closer to a basting stitch, but you can make your stitches even wider than that, and when top stitching, you'll want to make them much smaller. For the sake of time, I machine sewed my blanket, which you can do as well if you have a sewing machine, but hand sewing is just as strong and a really important skill to master. As you sew on the edge, leave about 6 inches of the blanket open and unsewn so you can inside out the blanket at the end. If you're having difficulty with the back stitch, because I know it can be difficult to understand if you're not learning it in person, you can always do a running stitch instead to sew your blanket together before you inside out it. As long as you make your stitches relatively small, it should be just strong enough because you're going to top stitch at the end as well. Once you've sewn around the whole edge, take out any pins you've left in the blanket, as well as your basting if you've decided to do so. Inside out the blanket, paying special attention to the corners and pushing them out to make them nice and square. Fold inside the open edges of the opening so that the raw edges aren't showing and the opening looks like all the other sides. Then you can pin it down and make sure it's folded correctly, and then iron the blanket again, paying special attention to all of the edges and pressing your seams folded. If your pins have plastic tops, take them out when you iron so that they don't melt. Top stitch around the edge, going through all of the layers about a half or quarter inch from the edge. This is a running stitch I showed you before, which would be like the basting stitch but much shorter. Once you've top stitched around the edge of your entire blanket, you're done.